The 1,970 seconds were a time when music, art, and fashion collided in wild and unexpected ways. At the heart of this cultural explosion was a place called Studio 54, a nightclub in New York City that became famous for its extravagant parties, over-the-top fashion, and a guest list that read like a who's who of the entertainment world. If you were anyone in music, film, or fashion, Studio 54 was the place to be. David Bowie was no stranger to the spotlight. By the late 70 seconds, he had already established himself as one of the most influential rock stars of all time. With his ever-changing image, bold fashion choices, and music that pushed the boundaries of what was considered normal, Bowie had become a symbol of rebellion and creativity. His fans adored him for his ability to constantly reinvent himself, always surprising them with something new. Whether he was Ziggy Stardust or the Thin White Duke, Bowie wasn't just a musician. He was an artist, a trendsetter, and a true original. But even David Bowie needed to let loose sometimes. And where better to do that than Studio 54? The club was known for its electric atmosphere, where the rich and famous rubbed elbows with the eccentric and the avant-garde. It wasn't just a nightclub, it was a celebration of freedom, a space where you could be whoever you wanted to be, without fear of judgment. The walls of Studio 54 had witnessed everything: extravagant costumes, strange performances, and spontaneous acts of creativity. It was a place where the rules didn't apply, and the only thing that mattered was having a good time. David Bowie's presence at Studio 54 was a given. He was a star of the highest order, and the club welcomed him with open arms. But that night, something different was in the air. It wasn't just another party, it was a night when two of the most famous faces in the world of music would collide in a way no one could have predicted. Enter Michael Jackson. At the time, Michael Jackson was on the verge of making history. He had already found fame as part of the Jackson 5, but he was now stepping out on his own as a solo artist. He was young, talented, and full of ambition. His album, Off the Wall, had recently been released, and though it had already begun to make waves, Michael was still finding his place in the spotlight. He was beginning to carve out a new identity for himself, one that would eventually lead to him becoming the king of pop. But even though Michael was still in the early stages of his solo career, he was already an undeniable force in the music world. His natural talent and charming personality made him a favorite among fans and celebrities alike. Like Bowie, he was a performer who understood the power of creating an image. His signature style, those smooth moves, that infectious energy, and, of course, the famous sequined glove were just the beginning of what would become a legendary career. One fateful night at Studio 54, the paths of David Bowie and Michael Jackson crossed. The two had met before, but this time, something was different. Both men were at the top of their game, but they were also very different. Bowie was the eccentric rock star who had already built a reputation for being outlandish, while Michael was the young, rising star who was still finding his voice as an artist. But the moment they shared at Studio 54 was something none of the other clubgoers would ever forget. The night was already filled with energy, people dancing to the latest disco hits, the sound of laughter and music mixing in the air, and the glittering lights reflecting off every surface. It was the kind of place where anything could happen, and that's exactly what made it so exciting. There was always the possibility of witnessing something unexpected. As the night went on, David Bowie and Michael Jackson found themselves talking, sharing stories, and laughing together. They both had a mutual respect for each other, Bowie for Michael's incredible talent, and Michael for Bowie's fearless approach to music and fashion. They were both known for pushing boundaries in their own ways, but there was an unspoken understanding that they were two very different types of stars. Bowie was already a household name, but Michael was still on his way to becoming one of the biggest stars in the world. They were both living in a world where being unique was celebrated, and yet, they each had their own version of what that uniqueness looked like. As the conversation continued, something happened that would change the course of the night. Bowie, ever the provocateur, leaned in with a mischievous grin and made a comment that would set the stage for one of the most legendary moments in music history. He said, "You know, Michael, you'll never be as weird as me." Bowie's words were playful, but they held a challenge. It was a dare, an invitation for Michael to step up and show him something that would rival the eccentricity that had defined Bowie's career. The challenge wasn't about who could be the most talented, it was about who could push the boundaries of weirdness further than the other. Bowie had always been known for his strange behavior and outlandish performances. But now, he was inviting Michael to join him in the realm of the unconventional. Michael, always quick with a smile and never one to shy away from a challenge, responded with a grin of his own. "I think I can out-weird you, David," he said. It was a bold statement, but Michael wasn't just making small talk, he was ready to rise to the challenge. After all, he was no stranger to pushing boundaries himself. He had always been a little different from the other pop stars of the time, and he wasn't about to back down from a challenge thrown down by one of the most famous rock stars in the world. And so, in the heart of Studio 54, surrounded by glittering lights and a crowd of curious onlookers, David Bowie and Michael Jackson made a pact of sorts. They would try to out-weird each other for the rest of the night. No one could have predicted how this playful challenge would unfold. But what followed would become one of the most iconic moments in music history. The night at Studio 54 was still young, and the energy was electric. People were dressed in the most extravagant outfits. The music was thumping through the speakers, and the atmosphere was filled with excitement. It was the kind of place where people came not just to dance but to be seen, to be noticed, to be part of something bigger than themselves. And that's exactly what David Bowie and Michael Jackson were doing. Both of them were not just artists. They were icons in the making. At this moment in time, they were at the very top of their careers, but they were also exploring new territory. Bowie was always known for reinventing himself. From his early days as Ziggy Stardust to his more recent image as the Thin White Duke, he was a master of creating personas. People didn't just love David Bowie for his music. They loved him because he was always so unpredictable. His style, his fashion, and even his attitude were all part of a performance, a work of art that he would share with the world. Whether he was dressed in extravagant costumes, painted in bold colors, or experimenting with strange ideas, Bowie was always the center of attention. And that night at Studio 54 was no exception. But that night, something was different. Bowie was not only surrounded by his usual fans, admirers, and fellow artists. He was in the presence of another superstar, Michael Jackson. At that point, Michael Jackson was still growing into his role as a solo artist. He had already achieved great success with the Jackson 5, but his solo career was starting to take off in new directions. His album, Off the Wall, had been released just a year earlier, and it was a big turning point for Michael. It marked his transition from the young, bubbly pop star of the Jackson 5 to a more mature, sophisticated, and experimental solo artist. The album's success was a sign of the new, more refined Michael Jackson, a man who was not only a great singer and dancer, but someone who could create music that moved people in new ways. But even as his career was beginning to soar, Michael had not yet fully stepped into the role of global megastar that he would soon become. He was still finding himself. He was still figuring out how to balance his public persona with his true self. Michael's creativity was boundless, but it was also evolving. What made him unique wasn't just his incredible voice or his dance moves, it was his ability to create something new, something nobody had seen before. Michael wasn't just copying what was popular at the time. He was inventing new styles, new ways of performing, and new ways of looking at the world. When Michael Jackson and David Bowie found themselves at the same table that night at Studio 54, it was as if two worlds were colliding. Bowie was the established artist with a wealth of experience in the public eye, while Michael was the rising star still carving out his own identity. But what they shared was an undeniable passion for creativity, for standing out, and for defying expectations. And, without even realizing it, they were about to engage in a playful but fierce contest of creativity that would mark the night forever. The conversation between the two began casually. They were two celebrities who had met before, but there was something different about this interaction. They were not just two famous faces passing the time in a club. They were two minds who understood what it meant to push boundaries and to defy the norms of the music industry. They began talking about their experiences in the music world, about how they saw the future of music, and about how they each approached their art. It wasn't a deep conversation, but it was one filled with mutual respect and understanding. David Bowie, always the one to push things further, leaned in after a while and made a comment that would change the direction of the evening. With a sly grin, he looked at Michael and said, "You know, Michael, you'll never be as weird as me." It wasn't a mean comment. It was playful, almost teasing. But, coming from Bowie, it carried a challenge. He had always been the eccentric one, the one who had defied convention and created art that made people think, question, and sometimes even feel uncomfortable. He had always been the one to stand out in a crowd, and now, he was daring Michael to try to outdo him. Michael Jackson, with his quiet confidence, smiled. He didn't take offense. Instead, he laughed and shot back, "I think I can out-weird you, David." It was the kind of challenge that seemed like a joke at first. After all, how could anyone out-weird David Bowie? He was already a master of creating strange, wonderful, and confusing images that captivated the world. But Michael wasn't just talking about his image or his fashion. He was talking about creativity itself. And in his mind, he had just as much to offer in that department as anyone. Bowie, of course, didn't back down. In fact, he encouraged it. "Go on then," he said, his eyes sparkling with the thrill of the dare. "Show me what you've got." It was a playful, yet serious moment. Both men understood that this wasn't just about a silly game, it was about expressing themselves in a way that would leave a lasting impression. For David, this was nothing new. He had spent his entire career reinventing himself, challenging norms, and pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. But for Michael, it was an invitation to let loose, to take risks, and to explore a side of himself that wasn't always visible in his music. What followed was a night of creative chaos. The two legends didn't just stop at teasing each other with their words. They began to compete in the most bizarre and creative ways possible. Bowie, always known for his extravagant fashion, began to change into one outrageous outfit after another. At one point, he even wore a costume that was half human and half something else entirely. An alien. A creature from another world. His movements were unpredictable. His expressions over the top. He was in his element, feeding off the energy of the room and the playful challenge that Michael had thrown down. But Michael was no slouch. He, too, began to push the boundaries of what people expected from him. He was known for his smooth moves, his perfectly timed dance routines. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't just performing, he was playing. Michael began to dance with an abandon that was both surreal and mesmerizing. He did the moonwalk, a move he had perfected. But he did it in a way that no one had seen before. He made eye contact with Bowie, as if daring him to keep up. Michael's clothes shimmered as he moved, and his body seemed to glide across the floor as if he were floating. It was a battle of creativity, but it wasn't just about who could be more outrageous or eccentric. It was about who could create something that truly captured the essence of their unique personas. And both Bowie and Michael had that ability in spades. They were artists at the peak of their powers, unafraid to challenge each other and the world around them. For the people watching, it was a moment of pure magic. The energy in Studio 54 was palpable. The crowd watched as the two superstars seemed to be locked in a silent competition, each trying to outdo the other in the most playful, surreal ways imaginable. It was a night that would go down in history as one of the most unique and unforgettable moments in the world of music and entertainment. As the night unfolded at Studio 54, the energy in the club only grew more electric. The music continued to pulse through the air, the flashing lights dancing on the walls, casting shadows over the crowd that filled the club. But the real show had begun. David Bowie and Michael Jackson, two of the most influential figures in music, were not just watching the scene unfold around them. They were creating a spectacle all their own, and the audience couldn't help but be drawn into the playful yet intense challenge they had unknowingly set up. Bowie, ever the master of reinvention, had already started to push the limits of what people expected from him. He was never one to shy away from being different. And tonight, he wasn't just being different, he was turning it up to the highest level. As soon as the challenge had been made, Bowie threw himself into it without hesitation. He walked around the club, taking in the atmosphere as if he were a character in one of his own music videos, sizing up the room, and seeing how far he could stretch the boundaries of what people thought was normal. He had always been a performer, not just a musician. For Bowie, there was no separation between his music and his public persona. Everything was part of a bigger performance. And tonight, his performance wasn't just about singing or playing an instrument, it was about creating a world that was bold, unpredictable, and often bizarre. The crowd was immediately drawn to him as he strutted across the floor in one of his signature costumes, his wild, colorful outfit impossible to ignore. His look was something out of a dream, a mix of sequins, feathers, and metallic fabrics. He wasn't just David Bowie anymore. He was a character, a living, breathing piece of art. And to everyone in Studio 54, it was exactly what they had come to expect from him. Bowie's movements were fluid, almost otherworldly. He would sway, twirl, and pose, as if he were trying to blur the lines between performer and art. His face was painted in vibrant colors, almost like a mask that allowed him to step into another persona entirely. He seemed to be enjoying the process of becoming someone new every minute. But even though he was surrounded by other partygoers who were also dressed in eye-catching outfits, Bowie stood out in a way that nobody could match. He was the center of attention, and he knew it. But Michael Jackson wasn't about to let Bowie steal the spotlight. If anything, the challenge had ignited something in Michael, a fire that he couldn't ignore. Michael had always been known for his extraordinary talent as a dancer, but tonight, he was determined to show that he could match Bowie's eccentricity. He had always been a perfectionist, and his performances were often incredibly polished. But in this moment, there was no need to be perfect. Tonight was about letting go and pushing the boundaries of what he had done before. Michael began to move, his body flowing to the beat of the music, with an energy that was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. His famous moonwalk, the move that would become his signature, was just the beginning. He wasn't just dancing. He was creating something entirely new in front of the crowd. Every movement he made was more exaggerated, more dramatic, more theatrical. It was as if he were channeling something otherworldly. His feet glided across the floor with the precision and smoothness of someone who had mastered the art of movement. But this wasn't just about technical skill, it was about embracing the weirdness, the eccentricity, and the energy that Bowie had challenged him to explore. The crowd started to gather around the two superstars, watching as they both pushed the limits of what people thought was possible on a dance floor. Bowie was spinning, almost twirling, in his sparkling costume, while Michael's feet seemed to defy gravity as he slid and glided across the floor. It was a contest. But it wasn't about who was better. It was about who could take things further, who could be more outrageous, who could surprise the other. And as the night went on, it became clear that this playful challenge wasn't just entertaining the people in Studio 54, it was captivating them. The interaction between the two legends wasn't just about showmanship, though. It was about creativity, about letting go of the normal rules of performance and embracing the strange, the unusual, and the unexpected. Bowie and Michael were both pioneers in their own right, constantly reinventing themselves. And tonight was no different. They had stepped into Studio 54 with one goal in mind: to be seen, to be remembered, and to have fun. And that's exactly what they did. Bowie, always known for his bold fashion choices, began to up the ante. He donned an outfit that seemed straight out of a futuristic movie, shiny metallic fabrics that caught the light with every movement. His face, already painted in bright colors, became even more exaggerated, with wild swirls of neon greens, pinks, and purples. He wasn't just dancing anymore. He was performing an art piece, and everyone around him could see it. The energy he exuded was contagious, and even those who were usually reserved or shy couldn't help but be drawn into his orbit. Meanwhile, Michael Jackson was finding his own rhythm, his own strange, unique style. He wasn't just trying to match Bowie. He was creating something entirely his own. He was, of course, still dancing. But it wasn't just about the dance moves anymore. It was about the entire performance. He added little flourishes, quirky hand gestures, and exaggerated facial expressions that made him seem almost like a character from a surreal dream. As he moved, he exuded an aura of coolness and charisma, drawing the crowd in with every step. The atmosphere in Studio 54 was electric, and it felt as though anything was possible. The two superstars were pushing each other to be more creative, more bizarre, and more unexpected. They were living in the moment, not worried about how their performances would be remembered, but simply enjoying the act of creation. It was as if the night had taken on a life of its own, with Bowie and Michael as the two central characters, leading the charge into the unknown. The crowd couldn't get enough of it. People watched in awe, marveling at the spontaneous, almost surreal performance taking place before their eyes. Bowie and Michael weren't just dancing or performing music, they were creating an experience. It wasn't about competing with each other. It was about embracing the joy of being eccentric, of letting go of the need for perfection, and simply being yourself, no matter how strange that self might appear. As the night wore on, the two stars continued to one-up each other, each trying to outdo the other in the most bizarre, creative ways. But what was most amazing wasn't the competition, it was the way they both embraced the freedom to be weird. In a place like Studio 54, weirdness wasn't something to shy away from. It was celebrated. And both David Bowie and Michael Jackson, in their own unique ways, had mastered the art of being as weird as possible. For everyone watching, it was clear. This was more than just a night at a nightclub. It was a performance, a collaboration, and a reminder of why both Bowie and Michael were so loved. They weren't just stars, they were artists who understood the power of creativity, of pushing boundaries, and of letting go of what was expected. And in the process, they created a moment that would go down in history as one of the most unique and legendary nights Studio 54 had ever seen. The audience, mesmerized by the spectacle, continued to cheer them on. The night seemed to last forever. A whirlwind of music, dance, and pure, unadulterated creativity. There was no clear winner in the challenge between Bowie and Michael. It wasn't about who could out-weird the other. It was about celebrating the freedom of being different, of embracing the strange and the unexpected. The night had become a celebration of everything that made both men unique: their originality, their vision, and their willingness to take risks. As the hours passed, it was clear that the night at Studio 54 would go down in history as one of the most unforgettable events in pop culture. For those lucky enough to be there, it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. They had witnessed two legends at the height of their powers, pushing each other to new creative heights. And though the night would eventually come to an end, the impact it had on everyone present was undeniable. It wasn't just about the wild outfits or the eccentric dance moves. It was about the spirit of collaboration and creativity that Bowie and Michael had shared, creating a moment that would live on forever in the hearts and minds of those who had witnessed it. The wild night at Studio 54, which had been full of color, eccentricity, and unexpected creativity, was slowly drawing to a close. The crowd, still buzzing from the energy of the evening, began to disperse. But the memory of what had happened that night remained vivid. For those who had been lucky enough to witness it firsthand, the event would live on in their minds for years to come. The stories of David Bowie and Michael Jackson's unforgettable, playful challenge would be shared again and again, becoming a piece of pop culture history. The impact of that night, however, went far beyond just the fun and the eccentricity of the two stars. It was a reminder of something much bigger, something that both Bowie and Michael Jackson had in common: their ability to defy expectations and break the norms of their respective worlds. The night at Studio 54 was not just a random moment of fun, it was a symbol of the power of creativity, of pushing boundaries, and of embracing individuality without fear of judgment. David Bowie, by this point in his career, had already proven that he was a master of reinvention. He had transformed himself countless times, becoming new characters, new personas, and new sounds. His ability to shift between identities, to experiment with different styles, was one of the reasons he had earned his place as one of the most influential figures in music history. But even with all his fame and success, Bowie never lost the spark of curiosity that led him to constantly explore new artistic territory. That night, he wasn't just putting on a show, he was immersing himself in the creative moment, challenging himself to go even further than before, and in turn, challenging everyone around him. Michael Jackson, on the other hand, was just beginning his meteoric rise to global superstardom. At the time, he had already achieved success with the Jackson 5, but his solo career was starting to take off in ways no one could have imagined. Off the Wall, the album he had released a year before, was a huge turning point for him. It showed the world that Michael was more than just a young pop star. He was a true artist who was willing to take risks and explore new musical directions. His smooth moves, iconic voice, and magnetic stage presence were already well known. But the night at Studio 54 showed a different side of Michael. He wasn't just dancing, he was engaging with the world around him, creating art, and embracing the weirdness and fun that Bowie had dared him to explore. What made that night so legendary wasn't just the playful rivalry between Bowie and Michael. It was the way they both understood the importance of being unapologetically themselves. Neither of them cared about fitting into the molds of what people expected from musicians. Bowie's unpredictable nature and willingness to blur the lines between art, fashion, and music had already set him apart. Michael's willingness to reinvent himself, to challenge the norms of what was expected of a pop star, was what would lead him to become the king of pop in the years to come. In a way, the challenge they set up for each other at Studio 54 that night became a microcosm of their careers. It wasn't about competition in the traditional sense. It was about celebrating the freedom to be unique. Bowie and Michael were both artists who weren't afraid to stand out, to be different, and to take risks in ways that others couldn't or wouldn't. They understood that art was about more than just pleasing an audience. It was about creating something new, something that challenged the status quo. The playful nature of their interaction at Studio 54 also showed how, despite their fame, both men still saw the value in enjoying the moment and having fun. It was easy to imagine that, as massive stars, they might feel pressure to always be on, to always be perfect in their performances. But that night, they weren't concerned with perfection, they were concerned with expressing themselves and having fun while doing it. There was something incredibly refreshing about that. In the middle of their busy, high-profile careers, they allowed themselves to be spontaneous, to laugh, to let loose, and to embrace the weirdness of the night. As the party wound down and the lights of Studio 54 dimmed, it became clear that the event was more than just a memorable night out. It was a pivotal moment in the careers of both Bowie and Michael Jackson. For Bowie, it was another instance of him pushing boundaries, of reminding the world that he was an artist who refused to be boxed in. For Michael, it was a moment of self-discovery, of embracing his own eccentricity and creativity, which would become the hallmark of his later career. Though the night at Studio 54 didn't make headlines in the same way that their professional achievements would in the years to come, it left a lasting impact on those who were there to witness it. For the people in that room, it wasn't just about the music or the dancing. It was about the moment when two of the greatest musicians of all time came together and created something truly special. It was a reminder of the power of creativity, of the importance of embracing who you are, and of the value of pushing yourself to be more than what others expect. In the years that followed, both Bowie and Michael Jackson would go on to shape music history in ways that few others could. Michael's Thriller album, released a few years later, would make him an international sensation, while Bowie would continue to evolve, exploring new sounds, personas, and artistic avenues. But both men would always remember that night at Studio 54. It was a night that reminded them, and the world, that true creativity knows no limits. As the years went by, stories of that night would become part of the fabric of pop culture. People would tell tales of the strange, a magical evening when David Bowie and Michael Jackson dared each other to be as weird as possible, and in doing so, they created something legendary. It wasn't just a battle of eccentricity. It was a celebration of art, individuality, and the freedom to be different. In the end, there were no winners or losers, only two artists, sharing a moment of creative joy that would live on in the stories of those lucky enough to witness it. And so, the night at Studio 54 became a legend, not because of the weirdness or the outrageousness of it all, but because it captured the very essence of what made Bowie and Michael Jackson two of the greatest artists of all time. Their legacy was built on their ability to embrace the unexpected, to challenge themselves, and to remind us all that, sometimes, the most beautiful moments in life come when we let go of all expectations and simply enjoy the creative freedom of being ourselves.